Elders Climate Action is really excited this evening to have Nathaniel Stinnett as our guest speaker for this national call. Nathaniel is the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that uses data analytics and behavioral science to mobilize environmentalists to vote. Nathaniel's been named as one of 5 global visionaries by the New York Times in 2018 and dubbed the voting guru by Grist magazine. If I can say that 3 times fast. He's a very frequent guest speaker on cutting edge campaign techniques and behavioral science behind getting people out to vote. He's had many senior leadership and campaign manager positions on US Senate, congressional, state, and mayoral campaigns. And he's on the board of advisors for MIT's Environmental Solutions Initiative. He has a BA from Yale and a JD from Boston College Law School and lives in Boston with his wife and 2 children. And we're very happy to have collaborated with Nathaniel and with the Environmental Voter Project through our Elders Promote the Vote project. So Nathaniel will tell us much more about what's coming up.
Thank you, Frances. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for taking some time out of your day and out of your evening to learn about our work at the Environmental Voter Project. And for those of you who already know about us, what's coming up this fall. I just want to start with a few things. First, Frances, thank you so much for being such an indefatigable activist and volunteer, and for all of the amazing work that I know you do for Elders Climate Action, but also for the Environmental Voter Project and so many other causes. So just thank you. And thank you, Jen and Mark, for your leadership. Also, Paul Dreyfus, I don't know if he's on the line, but I know that he spends a lot of time coordinating the Elders Promote the Vote. 6 years ago, when the Environmental Voter Project was in our, not even our first year, like our proof of concept year, our trial year, I met Paul and we started working with Elders Climate Action. And I'm just so grateful to Paul for everything that he has done as well. The second thing I'll say before we get started is, as Frances said, although I live in Boston with my wife and 2 children, right now I am in a shack on the coast of Maine. So forgive the background. This is the one place where we have internet service up here in Maine. So please forgive that. All right, let's go ahead and get started. I am going to share my screen here. And as Frances mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about our work at the Environmental Voter Project, what we do, why we do it, how we do it, what are the results. But for those of you for which this is old hat, don't worry, there's going to be lots of new stuff as well. And we're going to get into what we're seeing currently in our voter file data about where there are lots of opportunities, not just for the environmental movement, but for environmental voters, and perhaps most importantly, for environmental volunteers over the next 11 weeks. And then we will close by having what I imagine will be a great Q&A session. So I really look forward to that as well. Let's go ahead and get started. The Environmental Voter Project is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is just laser focused on 2 things. 1, finding already persuaded environmentalists who don't vote, and then 2, turning them into better voters. That's it. That's it. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. So that also means we don't do a lot of the stuff that many environmental nonprofits do focus on. So for instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to persuade people to care more about climate or the environment. A good way to think about our work is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. We find people who already care so deeply about climate and other environmental issues that it's their #1 priority, yet they aren't voting. And then we make a purely behavioral intervention to try to turn them into better voters. that allows us to be nonpartisan, but it also allows us to use really powerful, in fact, far more powerful messaging to change people's behavior. And the reason we focus on this is illustrated in part by what you see here. I think we all know that for the first time, not just in a decade, but maybe the first time ever, the United States federal government acted on climate and passed a really big piece of climate legislation. But what I think we also know is that it shouldn't have taken 40 years, and it's not nearly as much as what physics requires. We got to do a whole lot more. And one of the reasons we aren't consistently doing a whole lot more, one of the reasons it took an entire generation to get what we've got and why we still need to do so much more, is because of what you see right here in this poll. This happens to be a poll that's only a month old. The Environmental Voter Project commissioned it. It was taken of registered voters in 4 battleground states, so Pennsylvania, Nevada, Georgia, and Arizona. And what you're looking at here are people who are likely to vote. And we asked them what their top 3 priorities were. Only 15% even listed climate or some other environmental issue among their top 3 priorities. Now, to be clear, that's higher than where we were 2 or 4 or 6 years ago, but that is nowhere near where it needs to be to try to get a repeat of the Inflation Reduction Act every 2 or 4 or 6 years like we need, or to get repeats of that at the state and local level. And when we narrowed this down to just asking likely voters what their number 1 issue priority was, only 4% listed climate and the environment, tied with the number of people who listed voter fraud as their number 1 priority. Sorry, but like, we need it to be so much more than that. So much more than that. And what I'd like to discuss just during the first sort of 5 minutes of this presentation is this problem. Oftentimes in the environmental movement and in any issue constituency group, activists like to pretend that we're stronger than we are. We like to pretend like we have all this power, and man, those crazy politicians just don't get it. Like, why don't they see that we have all this power? And we're not helping ourselves by not honestly diagnosing our problem here. The truth is, we don't have enough power. The truth is, there aren't enough likely voters who are listing climate and the environment as their top priority. We need more. When only 4% of likely voters going into a midterm election list climate or the environment as their top priority, maybe we'll get lucky. Maybe we'll get lucky and we'll eke out that 50th vote from a coal baron in West Virginia, but most of the time we won't. And we need to have more political power. And maybe perhaps the biggest reason why we need more political power and why this polling data is so important is because of this. For those of you who have heard me speak before, forgive me because I'm about to spend 2 minutes drilling down on something that you've heard me say before, but oh my gosh, is it important? So I'm going to say it again. Whether you vote or not is public record. I'm going to repeat that. Who you vote for is secret. I think we all know that. But whether you vote or not is public record. It's public record. And not only is it public record, but that is the essential building block for how all campaigns are run and how all policy is made. And take it from someone who has run dozens of campaigns, big or small. The first meeting any campaign has is they open up public voter files and they look and they see who is likely to vote in the election you're trying to win. Let's say that you're running for governor in a midterm and you find all these people on public voter files who aren't even registered. Nope, not going to talk to them. This group is registered. but they never actually vote. Nah, not going to talk to them either. This group is registered over here, but they only vote in presidential elections. Probably not going to talk to them either. Unless you have so much money and so much time that you can finally get to them at the bottom of the barrel. Oh, here's a group of people who are registered and they vote in midterms. Great. Yes, we'll talk to them. Oh, and here are people who even vote in local elections. We'll talk to them too. And not to put too fine a point on it, but we literally know who these people are by name and street address. And so anybody who is running for anything starts by looking at these public voter files, and with limited time and limited money, and their only goal is getting 50% plus one of the vote on a Tuesday in November, most of the time they can only afford to talk to people who have a history of showing up for that election. And if you're only going to talk to the likely voters, who do you think they're going to poll to figure out what issues they care about? Not the people who don't show up. And again, it's public record what elections you vote in and what elections you don't. And so if I'm running a gubernatorial campaign, do I really care about the issue priorities of people who are just registered to vote but never bother to cast a ballot? No, I don't. And I know this sounds cynical. I'm sure many of you are frustrated by this, but this is something that we accept in every other aspect of our lives, right? Like you wouldn't expect Starbucks to care about you if you don't drink coffee. You wouldn't expect Ford Motor Company to market cars to 3-year-olds who can't drive. No, you market your product to people who might actually be interested in it. And politicians do the same thing. They figure out through public voting histories who shows up and who doesn't. They only poll the people who show up to figure out what they care about. And that's why polls like this are such bad news for the environmental movement. Because politicians only bother to poll and do market research on people who have a history of showing up. And far, far, far too few voters care deeply about climate and the environment. And we are not doing ourselves any favors by not admitting this. To diagnose the problem accurately. Most of the time, if politicians aren't doing what we want them to do, it's not because they're stupid. It's not because they don't want to get elected. It's because they do want to get elected and they're measuring what voters care about. And although lots of voters care about climate and the environment, far too few listed as a top priority or one of priorities. And that's what really is policymaking. I promise you that Jen and Sus and Mark wouldn't have invited me to speak to you if it was doom and gloom and all bad news. So now let's get into the rest of this presentation. But I do think it's important to accurately diagnose this problem. We do not have enough political power in the climate and environmental movements. There are not enough climate first voters. The reason we at the Environmental Voter Project focus on what we do, the reason we focus on finding already persuaded environmentalists who don't vote and then turning them into better voters, is because we dug deep beneath lots of polling data like this. And we realized, wow, lots of voters don't care deeply about climate and the environment. But when we broaden our aperture, when we look at more than just the people who show up to vote and actually look at all registered voters, or maybe even all adults, well, then the numbers start going up. And more of them start caring deeply about climate and the environment. And that kind of confused us. We were wondering what was going on there. And the more we dug into it, the more we realized there was a pretty simple explanation. And that is simply that environmentalists aren't voting. It turns out the reason so few voters list climate as a top priority is not because too few Americans do. It's just that all of the Americans who care deeply about climate and the environment aren't voting, or I shouldn't say all, but many of them. And to give you an idea of what I mean by this, we looked at our data, and I'll get into how I can present these numbers to you and how we measure this. But we looked at previous elections. And in 2016, over 10 million already registered voters that were already registered, who have a very high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their #1 priority over all other issues, just stayed home and didn't cast a ballot on election day. An election that was decided by 77,000 votes. The last time we had a midterm election, almost 12.5 million super environmentalists didn't cast their ballots. And looking at people's previous voting histories, going into the upcoming midterms, we see that over 13 million registered voters have a very high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their #1 priority, yet they have never voted in a midterm or any other election of lower turnout than a midterm. So we have to think that they are unlikely to vote unless someone makes an intervention, unless someone goes and gets them. Now that's frustrating, I get it. But it's also an extraordinary opportunity. And the reason it's an opportunity is because we live in a moment in time where it's become increasingly hard to change people's minds about anything, especially climate change, especially environmental issues. And what these enormous pools of non-voting environmentalists represent are people who don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They don't need issue education. These are people who, like, you shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. They're just not voting. And that is a real opportunity because, as I'll discuss over the next 5 minutes, we have the ability to identify these people and message to them using proven messages that we know increase their likelihood of voting. And any of you who have been working through Elders Promote the Vote with the Environmental Voter Project know this. You know that we give you tested, proven messaging, and we also report back to you the results of our randomized control trials that prove it increases turnout. And you don't need to take my word for it. I'm going to get into those results. But before we move there, I just want to spend one more moment talking about this. This is a huge pool of potential political power. And so all those times you think, my gosh, why aren't politicians doing this? Why aren't politicians doing that? I wish we had more power. Well, I'm not saying you shouldn't go out there and try to persuade people who don't care about climate to start caring about it. I'm just saying you don't need to. Because there are all these people who are already persuaded, and we just need to change their behavior. And of course, that's not easy. I am not claiming that behavior change is easy, but it is easier, and it is cheaper, and perhaps most importantly, because whether you vote or not is public record. You can test your messaging and then see who ends up voting and who doesn't, which is something you can't do if you're trying to change people's opinions or change their minds or change their priorities. It's much, much harder to measure that. All right, so this is why the Environmental Voter Project is so laser focused on identifying non-voting environmentalists and then changing their habits and making them vote. Very briefly, I'm going to get into how we do it, and bear with me, it will be brief. I want to keep it brief because I want to get to the Q&A, and also I'm mindful of the fact that although I'm introducing many of you to EVP for the first time, many of you are old hat at this. And so I don't want to spend a lot of time going over what you already know. So bear with me if I breeze through some of the next section. All right, what EVP does is we take a 3-step process: identification, mobilization, habit reinforcement. With identification, we build predictive models on voter files that allow us to individually identify who these non-voting environmentalists are. In the next 2 slides, I'm going to get into how we do that in a little bit more detail, but only a little bit more detail. But what this allows us to do is then have this population of people who we've individually identified So not broad demographic groups, but individuals, Mary Ann Smith at 123 Main Street, who we know care deeply about climate and the environment, but are unlikely to vote based off their previous voting history. And that allows us to go to step 2, mobilization, because then we can be completely agnostic with our messaging. We can leverage the latest behavioral science and talk about whatever we want, so long as we can prove that it's really good at turning these non-voting environmentalists into voters. Because remember, we don't need to do any issue education with these people. We don't need to convince them to care about climate. It's already their #1 priority. We could talk about chocolate chip cookies if that's what gets these people to vote. And so we canvass and call and mail and send digital ads, running hundreds of randomized control trials, letting us know which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists, just to do one thing, and that's turn them into better voters. And then finally, the third step, habit reinforcement. We work year round, as many of you know, because if you want to turn someone who doesn't vote into a habitual voter, you don't need to be a behavioral scientist to understand that you can't just talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big federal election going on. No, you need to take advantage of every behavioral intervention opportunity. Every local election, every state election, every federal, every primary, every general, every special, every single one is an opportunity to start building these good voting habits. And I know you're not used to talking about voting as being habitual, but it is, just like any other behavior, just like exercising or eating healthy, or when you drink your coffee in the morning. There are probably many of you who can tell me right now that you are going to vote in the 2030 midterms. But none of us even know who's going to be running in the 2030 midterms. You don't even know what's going to be on your ballot, but you know that you're going to do it because you're a voter. It's part of your personality. It has become something that you do. This is why we take habit reinforcement really seriously. All right, again, very quickly, I'm going to breeze through how we identify and then some of the messaging that we use. We'll get to the results and then most importantly, some of the opportunities that we're seeing. We build predictive models to individually identify these voters. What we do is the same technique that all of the sophisticated US Senate and gubernatorial campaigns are using right now. So this is not unique to us. This is how US Senate races are targeting voters right now. And what they do is this. They start by polling thousands of people, tens of thousands of people per state. And just ask them, I'll use EVP as an example. We just ask them one question. What's your #1 most important political priority? And let's say in Pennsylvania, we poll 10,000 people and 1,000 of them tell us that climate's their #1 priority. Well, then we can start figuring out, okay, what do we know about these 1,000 people? What data is there in the voter file? What census data is there on them? What publicly available consumer data do we have on them? We only use publicly available data, but there's a lot of it out there. And then the data scientists we work with can start looking for hidden patterns and correlations. Maybe they'll realize, oh, if you're a forestry employee in Pennsylvania, you're 11 times more likely than the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as your top priority. Maybe if you're a new homeowner, but you've got no kids, you're 6 times as likely as the average Pennsylvanian. Maybe if you buy exercise and health products, you're twice as likely as the average Pennsylvanian to list climate as your top priority. And none of these data points are predictive on their own. But when you start clustering them, then they have a lot of predictive power. Then you can start saying things like, oh, if you are a Latina grandmother who lives within 5 miles of Philadelphia, bought a Volvo between 8 and 10 years ago, and has grandchildren in the public schools in Montgomery or Delaware County, and subscribes to National Geographic, you've got like a 92% likelihood of listing climate as your top priority. And then they find another cluster and another cluster and another cluster. And we end up building a model that helps us predict who were some other people who might care deeply about climate and the environment. So not just those 1,000 people who told us when we polled them what their number one priority is, but maybe some other people like them. And it's almost like an insurance company building an actuarial table where they use your health and medical history and your exercise and your drinking and your smoking habits to predict how expensive it will be to sell you health insurance or life insurance and how long you're going to live and things like that. Only we're not trying to predict how long everybody in Pennsylvania is going to live. We're trying to predict who all the super climate people are. And it's a long iterative process, but at the end of it, what we're able to do is literally assign a score from 0 to 100 to every single voter in Pennsylvania. And what you're looking at is a distribution chart of all of them. And you'll see there are millions of Pennsylvanians who have like less than a 30% likelihood of listing climate as their top priority. Not surprising, right? And there are a whole bunch of people in the middle, and we don't really know. Maybe they've got like a 50% likelihood. But then there are well over 1 million who have a greater than 85% likelihood of not just caring about climate and the environment, but quite literally listing it as their number one priority. Now, does this mean we've spoken to every single Pennsylvanian and got them to sign on a piece of paper that climate's their number one priority? No, no, no. This is a predictive model. But these are enormously accurate. And to give you an example of how accurate they are, after these data scientists build these predictive models for us, we say, okay, thank you very much. And we cut off that top 15%, the people who score an 85 or above. And we ship that list out to a different polling and data shop. And we say, can you poll these people? And ask them an open-ended question, ask them, hey, what's your number one most important political priority? Every single time we've done that, over 85% of the respondents have said, oh, funny you should ask, climate or some environmental issue. This is a very precise way to target people. And not because we're particularly good or bad at it, this is just where the technique is. And then, I'm going to repeat it for like the 6th or 7th time tonight, whether you vote or not is public record. We don't need the data scientists to then figure out which of these super environmentalists don't vote and which of them do vote. And what you're looking at right here is a map of the 42,067 registered voters in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who have a greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate or the environment as your top priority. They've never cast a ballot in their lives. And because this information is on voter files, we have their names, we have their phone numbers, we have their street addresses. So volunteers through Elders Promote the Vote can call them or canvass them. This is how we identify these super environmentalists who are unlikely to vote. And then we canvass, we call, we postcard, we send digital ads and direct mail to them using all of the behavioral science informed messaging that our randomized control trials have shown increases their likelihood of voting. And I'm happy in the Q&A to get into some of the behavioral science that we use that informs these experiments and informs our messaging. I am really excited to nerd out and talk about that behavioral science stuff, but I'm mindful of the time, and so I want to keep going and get into how powerful this messaging is and how powerful the opportunities are as we look ahead to the upcoming midterms in the next 11 weeks. So what we do is we run lots of experiments to figure out which messages work best to increase turnout among these non-voting environmentalists. And the way we do it is, as I said, working year-round in hundreds of elections. And what you're looking at now is just what we did last year in an odd year. Most groups did almost no voter mobilization in an odd year. We were active in 381 elections in those 17 different states. And what we did was we measured our impact through something called randomized control trials. And I know this might make your head spin hearing language like this, but bear with me for a moment because I think it's so important for you as volunteers to understand why you do what you do and why you say what you say when you're talking to voters. It's because we run these mobilizations through very scientifically rigorous experiments so that we can prove they increase turnout. And here's how we do it. Let's take Pennsylvania again. Let's say we've identified 600,000 super environmentalists in Pennsylvania who are unlikely to vote in the midterm election. It's actually more than that, but let's just use 600,000. What we do not do is immediately start talking to all of them. Instead, before we talk to a single one of them, we randomly separate them into two groups. About 20% are in what's called a control group, and we never talk to them. The remaining 80% are in what's called a treatment group. These are the people we call and canvass and mail and send digital ads to with all of our behavioral science informed messaging. Then the election happens. Now for the 7th time, I will say, whether you vote or not is public record. And so a few months after the election, we can see how many of these unlikely to vote environmentalists in our treatment group actually voted. And then we can compare it to the unlikely to vote environmentalists who are in our control group, who we never spoke to. And as long as that initial separation process was truly random, and as long as the numbers are big enough to get something called statistical significance, I'm not going to go into the math behind that or the statistics behind it, but I think you can understand, like, you can't do this with like really small numbers. You need to have big numbers. Well, as long as we do that, what that allows us to do is isolate what our sole impact was on turnout while controlling for all outside variables. Because even if some US Senate race spent $1 billion turning out voters in Pennsylvania, well, locked into our system and we spoke to the people in our treatment group, we've controlled for that. There are just as many people who that Senate race was contacting in our control group as in our treatment group. If it snowed in Altoona in that depressed turnout, well, we've controlled for that. There are just as many people in Altoona in our control group as in our treatment group. This allows us to isolate what our sole impact was on turnout, and perhaps more importantly, isolate which messages work best at increasing turnout over our control group. And just last year in 2021, we saw that we were solely responsible through our interventions for boosting turnout as much as 4 percentage points over our control group in local elections, and as much as 1.2 percentage points in statewide general elections. That 0.9% that you see down there in Georgia, that was for those 2 US Senate runoff elections, where $1 billion were spent. Environmental Voter Project only spent $550,000 in Georgia, yet we could tell from our randomized control trials that we were able to cut through $1 billion worth of static and be solely responsible for increasing turnout 0.9 percentage points among the 310,000 super environmentalists we were targeting. Those Senate seats kind of came in handy, didn't they? And these numbers are big. Ask Donald Trump how big a deal 1.2 percentage points is in Pennsylvania or 4 percentage points is in Kansas. These are big numbers. But perhaps most importantly for us is remember that idea of habit reinforcement. And forgive me if you've heard this story before. Some of you may have. It's my favorite story to tell over the last year. After those 2 Georgia US Senate races, everybody left Georgia, but not us. We went right back to work mobilizing low propensity environmental voters in, I kid you not, the Griffin Judicial Circuit District Attorney's special election. And if you don't know what a judicial circuit is, it's if your county is so small, you can't have your own DA. So you have to get together with other small counties and like share a DA on a judicial circuit. So like, this is how small this election was. And I completely admit It had nothing to do with environmental policymaking, but it had everything to do with changing people's behavior. It has everything to do with building good voting habits. And if now you're pressing refresh on Politico or 538 or CNN every morning to see where the polls are in Georgia, I can tell you it's really important to pay attention to dinky little elections like this in the winter of 2021, because this is how you create habitual voters. And by working year round like this, what we were able to see is that by the end of last year, after working for 6 full years, we had spoken to 8.7 million unique environmental voters at the Environmental Voter Project. Now, we're not counting any of the ones in those 5 light green states because we only expanded into those light green states last year. But in the other 12 states, EVP had spoken to 8.7 million unique voters who, by definition, were super environmentalists who were pretty awful voters who we would, or else we wouldn't be talking to them. We could see in public voter files by the end of last year that over 1,030,000 of them had become such consistent voters that they had voted in their most recent federal election, their most recent state election, and their most recent local election. They had become super voters. This is what our true goal is. This is how we really change the electorate. So that regardless of what our randomized control trials show us after the upcoming elections, we know that before the insanity even begins, before people even cast their ballots, we're walking into 2022 with all of these newly habitual environmental voters. And so for all of you who have been mobilizing people to vote for primaries and local elections this year, this is what you are creating. I know many of you were on a phone bank just this morning, mobilizing low propensity environmental voters to vote in the Florida primary where polls just closed. And you're doing that not necessarily because it's important who wins most of those primaries, but because that's how you create hundreds of thousands of habitual environmental voters in Florida. All right, we're going to rush to the finish so we can get to the Q&A. As we look ahead to the next 11 weeks, and yes, I don't want to cause any heart palpitations here, but we've got exactly 11 weeks from right now. That's when polls start closing, is 11 weeks from right now. Or maybe it's 12 weeks. No, 11 weeks, 11 weeks from right now. This is what we see. We are targeting 5.8 million super environmentalists in these 17 states. All of them are registered to vote. All of them have a very, very high, like greater than 85% likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their number one priority. Yet they've never voted in a midterm election or another election that's lower turnout than a midterm. And this is how it breaks down by state. I'm not going to read through every state for you. You can all, or many of you can read this. If you can't, we can send it to you in a format that's easier for you to read. But let me just take one state. Let me just take Arizona as an example. What you'll see here is we are targeting 249,841 super environmentalists in Arizona. This is after already removing that control group I told you about. How big is that number in the context of Arizona? Well, that's what we provide in that next column. Last time there was a midterm in Arizona, fewer than 2.4 million people voted. So what that means is our target population of these unlikely to vote super environmentalists in Arizona is so big that it would equal 10.5% of all ballots that were cast last time there was a midterm in the state. And to isolate some really, really high impact states for you, even though we're going to be active in all 17 of these states, I just want to drill down on these states. As you'll see, in these states, there is a perfect confluence of events where EVP has identified huge populations of these unlikely to vote environmentalists. And there are just tons of competitive elections. And I didn't even drill down into state and local stuff. I mean, look at Nevada. Almost 100,000 unlikely to vote environmentalists in a state where there's a tight US Senate, a tight gubernatorial, and 3 tight US House races. Look at New York. People aren't used to New York being an important state. It's got 9, according to the Cook Political Report, 9 competitive congressional races. That is tied with California for the most in the country. And if you narrow it down just to toss-ups, races that are so close that they can't even say which way it's leaning, there are 4 toss-ups. That's more than any other state in the country. These are states where we see an enormous opportunity for low propensity environmental voters, which means an enormous opportunity for volunteers who want to deliver nonpartisan, apolitical messaging to these low propensity environmental voters to just get them to vote. And as someone who was born in Philadelphia and grew up right outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, oh my gosh, is it important. And look at that huge population of low propensity environmental voters we've got in the state. So I know that Francis is going to go over a lot of the action items. I just want to say Elders Climate Action has phone banks every Tuesday at 12 p.m. Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific. Make it a habit. Show up for these. You only got 10 Tuesdays left until Election Day. You can do 10. You can do it. If those phone banks don't work for you, you can also go to environmentalvoter.org/get-involved and sign up for other phone banks. And I want you to already start making space in your head for the 5 days leading into Election Day, November 4th through November 8th. We are going to be calling nonstop. And if you can, in your head, just tell yourself, okay, I'm going to do a few phone banks then. That will be so important. And finally, if you're willing to canvass in one of those 17 states, we would love to help you do so. Canvassing remains the #1 best way to turn non-voters into new voters, and we would love to help you do that. All right, we've still got time for a good Q&A. I think I went 3 minutes over. I apologize to that, but I really, really, really look forward to your questions.
Nathaniel, that was great. Thank you. So we'll do some Q&A, then we'll talk just a little bit more about how you can take action. So I've got a few things in the Q&A box, but certainly we've got time for more questions. So put your questions there. One thing that came up is EVP is working in 17 states. How did those states get chosen?
Really, really great question. So while I am answering that, just so people don't have to try to remember what those states are, let me go back to sharing my slides here. So these are the 17 states that EVP is in. And what we do not do is choose these states based off of a particular election, like this midterm. Remember, what we are more focused on is this cumulative impact where election after election, year after year, we are building up the number of environmentalists who vote, not the ones who don't vote, but the ones who do vote, because remember, that's what drives policymaking. And so the way we choose these states are, first, where are there disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists? If we don't have a big target audience, kind of doesn't matter how good we are at what we do. If there are only 20 non-voting environmentalists in Idaho, who cares if we get them all to vote? That's not going to move the dial on policymaking at any level. So that's the first criteria. And you'll notice we are in a lot of so-called purple states, but we're also not in some other purple states and very important states like Wisconsin or Michigan or Ohio or Minnesota. We haven't found as many non-voting environmentalists in those states. So we think it would be kind of disingenuous to say, hey, work with us in these states, because we don't have as big an impact in those states. The second criteria we use, We want there to be an active election calendar every year in our states. Because if we can only talk to people like every 2 years, our cumulative impact is much, much less. And in some states, like say Oregon, for good government reasons, they've moved all their local elections to coincide with their even year federal elections. And that's pretty good policy, but it's bad if you're in the behavior change business. It's bad if you want as many bites at the apple to talk to non-voters to turn them into better voters. And then the third criteria we use is we don't just care about building up political power to change federal policymaking. We also care about moving the dial on state and local policymaking. That's why you see us in states like Massachusetts and New York, and also states like Kansas and Alaska. Because not only can they be important on the federal level, though often they aren't, they can be extraordinarily important on the state and local level. Believe me, what the economy of New York State does is important on a global scale. What the mayor of New York City does is important on a global scale. Take it from someone who lives in Massachusetts. Massachusetts, you might think of as being like, not that important a federal state. Well, we just elected the first like Green New Deal mayor in Boston last year. And even though we're known as a very liberal state, we had pretty awful statewide climate policy until about a week ago. It's really important to move the dial on the federal, state, and local level. So that's why we are in these 17 states.
Great, thank you. Someone was asking, will there be any postcarding this fall?
Really, really great question. So as many of you might know, we did multiple postcards through the year. Some in the winter, some in the spring, some in the summer. We are doing it in the fall again. However, what we wanted to do, because we had like 600 or 700 volunteers who had done postcards for us throughout the year, was first announce it to our already trained volunteers. It was not an easy decision to do, but we thought it was a bad decision to do. And we announced our postcarding campaign to volunteers, and it completely filled up. And so although we are doing a postcarding campaign this fall, I am sorry to say that it has already been capped. And I won't pretend like that was an easy decision. If some of you are disappointed by that, I don't blame you. But we thought it was better to disappoint people who had not spent all of their time doing postcarding for us earlier this year than people who had. What I can say to you is we are hoping to have expanded funding and expanded staffing next year so we can dramatically increase our capacity to do postcarding beyond what we currently do.
I think a lot of people would be happy to be involved in that. Even there are lots of other opportunities there for this year. Someone asked about the polls that you all send out. A lot of us get all sorts of polls in email. I get them in the mail. They ask us to indicate our priorities. Some of them, it seems like it's blatantly obvious what you're supposed to answer. And also a donation seems to be desired to go with that. And I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about how your polls might differ from that.
Yeah, so we do not, I mean, first of all, we rarely do polling, period. We do, as I described before, when I was talking about our predictive modeling, certainly there are surveys at the beginning of that and surveys at the end to test its accuracy, but there, like, we don't retain any of the individual level responses, and we don't then follow up and contact those people and say like, hey, you just told us that climate's your #1 priority, give us a donation or anything like that. We don't do that. We use them to build these models. And then when we build those models, we also don't solicit donations or volunteer work or anything like that from those models. It is solely for these voter mobilization purposes. Now, those of you who are listening closely might have caught me saying, we almost never do traditional polling. every now and then, maybe every 2 years, we've only been around for 6 years, but we do some polling. And if you go to our website, environmentalvoter.org, and look at our reports and studies tab, you will find the results of the poll that we did in those 4 battleground states that I alluded to just last week. For that, again, we are not trying to get people to tell us they care about climate so that we as an organization can then solicit anything from them. We don't do that. But what we are trying to do is discern a few things that your typical polls rarely dig into. So first, one thing we were trying to do with our polling was have enormous data sets in these 4 states so that we could discern differences between likely voters and unlikely voters. It's rare that you have polls that are big enough that do that, but that was really important to us because we wanted to figure out how motivated are environmentalists to vote. Is there a difference between how many likely voters and unlikely voters care deeply about the climate? And surprise, surprise, there is a pretty significant difference, especially in Pennsylvania and Nevada, where unlikely voters were almost twice as likely to list climate as their top priority. Again, you can shake your head and be frustrated by that, or you can view it as an opportunity. In 2 of the most important states this fall, unlikely voters are twice as likely to list climate as their top priority as the people who always show up for midterms are. That's why voter turnout is important. And then finally, we do a lot of this polling to try to figure out messages to test in our randomized control trials. So we ask a lot of kind of Dorothy behavioral science questions like, do you think you vote less often, more often, or the same as your parents or your children or your friends or ex-peer group? What we're trying to do is be sociologists and figure out, okay, what affinity groups and what peer groups do these targets of ours look to for their behavioral cues? And so we're almost approaching this polling, not like NBC News would, but like an academic would. We're trying to figure out what are the messages that we can test to fine tune our voter turnout strategies. Because one thing we always want to be able to do is look you in the eye, look our volunteers in the eyes and say, when you knock on a door, when you make a phone call, when you write a postcard, you are using messaging that we know from randomized control trials increases turnout over our control group. And every single time you get on one of our phone banks, I can guarantee you are using that messaging that at some point in the past has been proven to increase turnout. We know that for a fact, and that's so important to us, and the polls help us get there.
That's great. Do we know much about why these non-voting environmentalists don't vote?
Oh, whoever asked that question, it's a very, very good question. I could go on forever answering it, and obviously I don't have the time to do that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to break down my response between what we do know and what we just think we know. So any social scientist can tell you it's pretty easy to set up an experiment that tells you how to get someone to do something. That's what social scientists are really good at. What they're not terribly good at is the opposite, is figuring out why doesn't somebody do something? In this instance, why isn't this group of people voting? It's a really hard thing to measure, actually. Really, the only thing you can do is ask them, is poll them and say, when you don't vote, why don't you vote? And the problem with that is we have such strong societal norms saying that voting is a good thing that when you ask people that question, they lie their pants off. They try to give you reasons that they think are socially acceptable that will allow you to excuse them for being a bad actor. Or many times they'll just outright lie and say, no, I vote all the time. We know for a fact that they're lying because you can, again, go to the reports and studies tab on our website and see some of our studies that show that people lie all the time about how often they vote. So that's why it's really hard to measure this. But for whoever asked this question, let me tell you what we do know and then what we think is going on. First of all, what we do know is that these people who are really likely to list climate as their #1 priority, are more likely to be people of color than white. They're more likely to be young than old, and they're more likely to make less than $50,000 a year than more. What do those three groups have in common? Young people, lower income people, and people of color. They all vote less often than the average registered voter. And they are all the object of voter suppression efforts. I mean, if anybody anywhere is trying to make it harder for someone to vote, chances are they are either targeting people of color, young people, or lower income people. And so part of what we see here is just that demographic correlation. But here's the really interesting thing. It's not just that simple. Because when we drill down within those demographic groups, like if we just look at young people, or if we just look at Black Americans or Hispanic Americans, the ones who care about the environment still vote less often than their other demographic compatriots. So there's something else going on there, something unique to caring deeply about the environment. And I won't claim we have a really good idea of what that is. We've done a lot of testing. And again, you can go to the reports and studies tab at environmentalvoter.org and see that testing. But what I can tell you we think is going on is not that these people feel really disengaged or more disengaged than good voters do. A lot of the excuses they'll give are like, oh, politicians don't care about me or they don't care about the environment. But good voters think that too. And so we actually don't think that's what's driving this lower turnout. What we think is going on is that for over a generation, the environmental movement has been strangely apolitical. And it's taking a long time to overcome that. And what I mean by that is if you think about the messaging that you grew up with about environmental activism. So let's take me. I grew up in the late 80s and early 90s. Any of you remember give a hoot, don't pollute? Or all this talk about recycling? And now, even now, when you think about like what it means to be a good environmental activist, it's a lot of changing what you eat, changing the electricity you consume, changing how you get to work, all of which are important, but they're weirdly apolitical, aren't they? I mean, you'd never hear an NRA member talk about gun rights that way. You would never hear someone who cares about abortion talk that way. We in the environmental movement have for a very long time viewed environmental activism in an apolitical, personal responsibility way. And for those of you who are familiar with the history of the fossil fuel industry, you know, like they had a very sophisticated PR campaign to make us think that way. They were essentially trying to say, and spending millions and billions of dollars doing it, saying like, don't pay attention to that coal-fired power plant back there. It's your fault because you've got a plastic water bottle in your hand. Which is, of course, completely bonkers, but we bought it. We bought it. And I think the reason that we're dealing with this turnout problem in the environmental movement is that we're still trying to overcome that bias we all carry around with us, that if we want to be a good environmentalist, we've got to pick up litter or recycle or take personal actions, all of which are important, don't get me wrong, but have nothing to do with politics. And boy, is it important that we change that.
Thank you so much. We're unfortunately out of time. I apologize. People whose questions I didn't get to, we may be able to answer some of those offline. But we want to, in every national call, to give people some options for taking actions. We've got two ways that people can approach this. One is to do it, by going to the Elders Promote the Vote webpage and or the Environmental Voter Project website, and to look at the opportunities there and sign up for one or more of those. For Elders Promote the Vote, it's kind of a general, I'm interested, we'll get back to you about details. If you know a little bit more about your schedule and want to look at exact times and possibilities, there's more detail on that on the EVP website. So that's one way of doing it. Another way, we have a number of members who use the Climate Action Now app. For those of you who don't use it, it's an app to use on your phone or on your tablet. It makes it easy to learn about environmental issues, to call or email decision makers to take other kinds of actions. So we've got a set of those actions available for you. Now, first, I'm going to get the website links into the chat, so people who want to do that can see those and use those. And then there is a QR code that people who want to use the app can use. And if people are having trouble with the QR code, but you already use the climate action now, feel free just to go into the app. The only thing is that you won't necessarily get actions that are specifically related to this call, because there are hundreds of actions in the app. But they're all great actions, so don't feel like that you have to do that. Let me share my screen, hopefully here. Okay. See if I can get Zoom to cooperate with me. Okay, can people see the QR code? So you can use that QR code and scan that link and get started taking actions that way, if that's your preferred way of doing it. If you have problems with either one of those, please say something in the chat and we will try to troubleshoot that for you.
While everybody is taking actions, we can go ahead and close out the call and really say a big thank you to Nathaniel and to Francis for hosting tonight's call. So thank you so much, Nathaniel. It's always such a pleasure to have you join us and share all of your wonderful insights and information. And we really hope that all of you on the call will become a participant in the Elders Promote the Vote project and sign up for a phone bank sometime between now, or many phone banks between now and November.
Thank you, everybody.